Hello, I'm Emily Rhodes and I'm really excited to talk to you today about Gold Rimmed Spectacles by Giorgio Bassani. Very slim, very powerful book. This was the July pick for Emily's Walking Book Club. For those of you who don't know, we go for a walk once a month on Hampstead Heath to talk about a book. And if you can't make it along to the walk, we also have Zooms on a Monday evening and live discussion threads on Friday afternoons and a newsletter, which goes out every week now with loads of info about the book and other interesting news. So please sign up, join us, read with us. It's just emily'swalkingbookclub.substack.com. So let me tell you about this book, The Gold Rimmed Spectacles. If only these were gold rimmed. Unfortunately, they're just rubbish, plastic, Specsavers ones. But the gold rimmed spectacles, I think, actually are kind of right at the heart of the book. It's such a strong image, a metaphor, a kind of synecdoche for the wearer of the gold rimmed spectacles. Did you notice how I just snuck that term in there? It means a part that stands for the whole, I think. So when Bassani is writing about the gold rimmed spectacles, if he describes them as, you know, the lens being cracked or something, it's a way of describing Fadagati, the doctor who wears the spectacles. They come to kind of stand for one another. They symbolise him in a way. Dr. Fadagati is a gay doctor in 1930s Ferrara. He is really cultured and respected and is, you know, the sort of the best doctor in town. He has this lovely surgery where everyone loves going to the waiting room because it feels so cultured and civilized. And then there's this kind of shock when they discover his queerness, but they kind of come to terms with it. They sort of respect him by day and ignore him by night, is I think how it's put. But Fadagati, although he's very much I suppose the main character of the book, he is not the narrator. The narrator is someone else. He is telling Fadagati's story from a sort of perspective in the future. So he's looking back on this time when the narrator himself was a boy and going to university, and Fadagati was this older man. And it's only about halfway through the book when we witness Fadagati's position really begin to fall. So he's, how am I going to do this I'm going to attempt to draw a graph on screen, okay? So which way, sorry if I get this backwards, but basically Fadagati kind of comes into Ferrara. He's originally from Venice and he goes up and up and up and he's doing super well. He's like at the top. And then they realise he's gay and he goes down a bit. But he's still tolerated, so he sort of keeps on going along here. But then there's this fateful summer holiday where they go, I'm just going to remove my thing for a moment. Fadagati, basically the whole kind of town goes to the seaside, to this beautiful hot beach called Riccione. And Fadagati goes there with this kind of beautiful younger boy, which in itself is a slightly troubling dynamic, and one that actually in our group we had a lot of great discussion about, you know, the many questions posed by an older man taking a, you know, sort of teenager basically on holiday and paying for everything. But the sort of the gorgeous, very arrogant young man parades around and Fadagati's with him, and it's just, you know, it's too much. It's too in your face. Interestingly, this takes place on holiday outside of Ferrara. And I think, sorry, I'm going off on a slight tangent here, but I think there's a lot about Ferrara itself, this walled city, that works really well as a symbol for things being both, the difference between being inside the city and outside. I think the book is so much about insiders and outsiders. And this moment when they're outside the city on holiday is where Fadagati having just sort of survived being on the edge. You know, he was an insider. He nearly got sort of thrown out of respectable society because of his gayness. He just about hangs on in there. This massive display of gay affection from him sort of makes him start going really downhill. And then he has this massive row with the boy. The boy kind of chucks him. And, you know, Fadagati is just ruined. We know from there on, and it's confirmed later in the book, he's just going right down. I feel like maybe I shouldn't give away the ending, but believe me, it's not good. Just at this moment when they're away and on holiday, it's in, I think by this point, it must be the 1940s, early 1940s. Sorry if I'm not totally right there. Or maybe it's still the late 30s. Anyway, the narrator, it's suddenly revealed that the narrator is Jewish. And you suddenly see that just as Fadagati's position from insider changes to being an outsider, we get these little inklings of how the narrator's own position in Ferrara society is about to change. I'm going to read out a little bit, which I think captures this really, really powerfully. And it also really gets the way that Ferrara itself is so integral to the book. It's almost a character in its own right. I know that sounds slightly naff, but that's how it feels. So this is on page 96 of this edition. Translated, by the way, I should say, really beautifully, I think, by Jamie McKendrick. I haven't read the original Italian, but from what I gather, Bassani's style from what I gather, it's a bit of a Marmite style. People love the long sentences and people also struggle with them. But I think Jamie McKendrick really captures the long sentences. He actually, in an interview, he described it really well as this idea that in this quite short book, there are these long sentences. And so much of what Bassani writes about is the oncoming catastrophe and disaster of war. And it's almost as though the length of the sentences are trying to kind of put off the inevitable. Yeah, it makes me think a little bit of 1001 Nights, you know, just trying to keep on telling the story as much as you can within the confines of not very many pages. Okay, so this is towards the end of the book. It's when the narrator has come back from the fateful holiday where we see Fadagati kind of fall from grace. And we've discovered that he's Jewish. And there's this minor character called Cenzo, who's a sort of newspaper seller, sort of crying out, "Latest measures of the Great Council taken against the Joels," his cavernous voice hurled out with indifference. And the narrator is with his friend Nino when he hears this. And while Nino remained in a most uneasy silence, I felt in me, with inexpressible repugnance, the first inklings of the Jews' ancient atavistic hatred for everything that was Christian, Catholic, in a word, Goyish. Goy, Goyim, what a sense of shame, what a humiliation, what a loathsome falling off to think in these terms. And yet I had already managed this, I told myself, become exactly like any Jew whatsoever from Eastern Europe who had never lived outside his own ghetto. I thought of our own ghetto, of Via Mazzini, of Via Vigna Tagliata, of the blind alley Turciccioda. In a near enough future, they, the Goyim, would once more have forced us to swarm there, in the narrow twisting lanes of that wretched medieval quarter, from which, when all was reckoned up, we had emerged only some 70 or 80 years ago, piled one on top of the other, behind the gates, like so many frightened beasts, we would never again manage to escape. It's a really punchy moment. I think seeing the city in this way and this kind of flash forward that he does. He does it, I think, a couple of other times as well. And he also does it in the Finzi Contini, so one of his other books. Yeah, it's very powerful when you're telling the story from a position of the future. All the time you're sort of thinking back into the past, and suddenly you jump forward and you get this feeling of the oppressive inevitability of the horror that's coming. I think, so we talked a little bit about insider, outsider, and how this position is always in peril, I suppose. That as you're only an insider as long as the mass chooses not to see your difference. Because of course, you know, I think what this book really points out is that we are all individuals. We are all different. You know, Bassani makes a point here and there about someone's accent being from somewhere else. And yeah, there's this wonderful, well, awful, I should say, woman, Signora Levezzoli, who's got her quick Tuscan tongue. She's a real gossip. But, you know, there's this feeling that all the gang are together and you're part of that gang. And the narrator is really shown to be in the thick of that gang when they go on the train to university all the time. But that position is so precarious. You can so easily be cast out just whenever people decide to recognise that difference in you and refuse to tolerate that difference. And it's a very grim kind of statement of human character in a way. I think another thing, I mean, there's so much to say in this, but it's such a tiny bit, there's so much in it. One more thing I'm going to say is that Bassani is absolutely brilliant at making it incredibly specific in time and place. We're very much in 1930s Ferrara. Just from that little bit I read out, you know, they're the street names. It's so, you can almost draw the city map, having read this book. And you're so there, you know, Mussolini crops up in it. There's references to speeches and things. You're really in that time. But at the same time, he somehow elevates it or expands it to almost go through the specific into these very big universal questions. You know, insider, outsider, I think is one thing. A kind of doomed love is another. There's a great bit where Fadagatti talks about reading a short story, which transpires to be a Nathaniel Hawthorne story, all about a poisonous love. You know, it feels so perfect. There's also a brilliant passage where Fadagatti kind of goes along with this little dog for a while, and so much space is given to this dog, and he asks all these questions about the animal and the human. So at these times where suddenly we're not just in Ferrara, we're in this kind of mythic, allegorical place where we're asking these massive questions about what it is to be human. And then somehow he brings it back to Ferrara, or in fact, you know, to the spectacles, the gold rimmed spectacles. You know, in a way it's kind of clever. It's the perfect title, you know, because what are spectacles? They're these things that correct your vision. They're the things that slightly alter your vision. They make you see, you know, something. They make you magnify something. They refract things. They give you a slight double vision sometimes. You know, this book is so about vision and trusting our vision or not trusting our vision, different visions, and how much there is to see. Yes, I think that sort of scratches the surface. It's a really rich book to discuss. And while a few of us weren't wholly convinced by it at the beginning, I think because it does take a little while to get into, the sentences are quite long and slow, we all ended up really appreciating this book. So yeah, a great one to read. Thank you for joining me.